Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar about Students for Carbon Dividends. My name is Chris Carnevale, and I'm the Coastal Climate and Energy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. For those of you not familiar with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we're a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible energy choices that work to address the impacts of global climate change and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We're a membership organization, and we'd like to acknowledge our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website at cleanenergy.org. Now, I'd like to take a moment to review the basic functions of the Zoom platform on the bottom of your screen. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout the presentation. If you're having trouble hearing or seeing the slides, click the chat button and type in your problem so that we can help you troubleshoot. We've also saved time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. To ask a question, click the Q&A button along the bottom of your screen, and we will work to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Lastly, we're recording this webinar and we'll send you the recording once it is uploaded online. This webinar is part of the Southeast Coastal Climate Network webinar series. The Southeast Coastal Climate Network is a network of individuals and organizations interested in climate and energy in the Southeast. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like to receive regular news updates and action alerts, please join the network by visiting cleanenergy.org/SECCN or email me at chris@cleanenergy.org. Additionally, this is the first of 2 webinars we're hosting in a mini-series about youth leaders in climate action. Today's webinar will feature the work of Students for Carbon Dividends, and on August 8th, we'll host Our Children's Trust to discuss the lawsuits that students and young adults have filed against all 50 states and the federal government to push for the implementation of a science-based climate recovery plans. It's my hope that this mini-series of webinars focusing on youth climate leadership will inspire young people in the Southeast to get involved and for all attendees to share the information with any young people they know who might be interested. Next slide, please. Joining us today from Students for Carbon Dividends is Alex Posner. Alex is the president of Students for Carbon Dividends. He's a senior at Yale University, majoring in American history. Originally from New York, he has long been interested in climate policy and energy economics. He was a director's fellow at the Yale Institution for Social and Policy Studies and an intern with the Climate Leadership Council. He's also a longtime magician and has served as president of the Yale Magic Society and a volunteer with the nonprofit organization Magicians Without Borders. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alex.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really delighted to have the chance to tell you about what we're up to. First, just for some context, I'm actually on a break from jury duty at the moment, so you may hear some of the natural acoustics of the great city of New York in the background, but hopefully add a little zest to the presentation. So I'm going to just take over the screen share for now, if that's okay. And perfect. So I think the slide should be up. If it should say Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividends Plan, a breakthrough climate solution. If it's not, Chris, could you just alert me? But I'm going to march forward. I think it's all rocking and rolling. So as mentioned, my name is Alex Posner. I'm the founding president of Students for Carbon Dividends and a senior at Yale University, long interested in climate policy. So before we dive into specifically what we're doing on the student level, just wanted to give a little context for the Baker-Schultz plan, the idea of carbon dividends. I mean, we're sort of part of a larger movement, and our student effort grew out of this now national campaign for the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividends Plan and Framework. So, of course, we're well acquainted with the climate threat, with the threat of climate instability. And I think it's not often fully appreciated just what makes this so daunting, right? One is, of course, the sheer magnitude of it all. That's perhaps the most evident. 2, though, is the fact that it requires a species-level response, right? We have to put aside everything that has ever divided us as human beings and work in common cause. I mean, that truly is unprecedented. The word unprecedented is thrown around often. I think it's rarely earned. In this case, it is. I mean, every dispute, tribal conflict, tension, we have to somehow look beyond that and work together to solve this problem. And sure, there are things like human rights treaties, but if human rights are violated in one country, they're not necessarily violated in another. So there's sort of a collective action challenge here that's really unique. And then third, not only the magnitude of it, not only that it requires a species level response, but three, it's a race against the clock, right? Things like the degradation of democratic norms or poverty. I mean, those are terrible things, but they're not irreversible. Many of the consequences of climate are irreversible. So you sort of package these things together, and you have a truly daunting challenge, and I think one, understandably, that has been quite difficult to remedy in any clear and concrete sense. So we know we have to reduce emissions. That's the North Star. And the interesting thing is that if you actually talk to economists, there is consensus about what the optimal climate solution is. I mean, public debate is all over the place, and there's often a gulf between sort of expert dialogue and what the public is talking about, and that gulf very much exists here, right? If you talk to economists, they will say that climate is fundamentally a market failure, right? The social costs of carbon are not reflected in the prices we pay. And that pollution has a cost. We didn't know CO2 was garbage, so to speak. We didn't know it had this deleterious effect when we launched the Industrial Revolution, but we know now. And it sucks sort of profoundly. It is just spectacularly inconvenient, the greenhouse gas effect, but it is a feature of the planet we've been given, and it is in our interest to address it. So if you talk to economists, there actually is something very close to consensus about the optimal climate solution. These are all quotes from Nobel Prize winning economists. The Economics 101 solution, a no-brainer, irrefutable, eminently sensible, the most effective policy response to climate change. And that is a carbon price, most elegantly in the form of a carbon tax. And indeed, just quoting here from Greg Mankiw, who's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors to George W. Bush, chair of the econ department at Harvard. His econ textbook is one of the best-selling in history, best-selling econ textbook in the world. Says there is a complete consensus among economists that putting a price on carbon is the right thing to do. It's economists from the left, the right, the center. It's really a consensus view. And simply put, you make carbon more expensive, you get less of it. It sort of prices it into the market and unleashes a wave of innovation. Almost every economic projection and model that looks at how we're actually going to solve this crisis assumes innovation that hasn't happened yet. We must innovate to a large extent our way out of this, including finding ways to make existing technologies cheaper, and unleashing the power of the market is key. I mean, there are times where that isn't necessarily the case, and there's more of a doctrinal dispute about market mechanisms versus other approaches. There really is consensus on this, everyone from Bernie Sanders all the way to folks on the right like Greg Mankiw. Elon Musk, we need a carbon tax. If you ask any economist, they will tell you that is the obvious thing to do. So the Climate Leadership Council formed in February 2017 to sort of limited government climate solution to appeal to conservatives who, as is well known, have been sort of on the sidelines on this issue, and a free market climate solution built around the expert consensus on the optimal climate policy. I mean, carbon tax happens to be a market mechanism. It comes from the conservative canon, but it really provides the basis for a bipartisan breakthrough. That's the belief. So the Climate Leadership Council announced in February of last year this sort of conservative case for carbon dividends, authored by a really notable assemblage of conservative elder statesmen. You can see the list right here. Baker, Schultz, Mankiw, Feldstein, Paulson. I mean, these are some of the most distinguished conservative elder statesmen in the country. I mean, Baker and Schultz in particular, who are the namesake for the Baker-Schultz plan, have a pretty astonishing and impressive resume, to say the least. And as we know, this often it's not just the message, but the messenger. So advancing this kind of framework from distinguished conservative elder statesmen helps to build bipartisan support. So the plan meets pretty impressive list of qualities. It is endorsed by both environmental groups and fossil fuel companies, appeals to all sides of the political spectrum, shrinks government, and yields 3 times the emissions reductions. How's that for a selling point? would make the bottom 70% of Americans 223 million financial winners, and once implemented would spread from country to country, generating a truly global climate response. We talked about the need for a species level response, and put the US in the driver's seat of global climate policy. So a pretty impressive set of characteristics. It seems almost too good to be true. It isn't in this case, and I'll explain why in a second. So the best summary of this, I encourage you to check out the TED Talk after this webinar. Ted Holstead, who founded the Climate Leadership Council. It's sort of an 11-minute TED Talk, brilliant, and just lays out the thinking and the wisdom behind the Baker-Schultz plan. But essentially, there are four pillars to it. One is that sort of expert consensus of a gradually rising and revenue-neutral carbon tax. It is the market mechanism, but it really is the mechanism that there is consensus about from economists, environmental policy experts. And then basically the plan says, instead of returning this money to the American, or to grow the size of government, which generally doesn't appeal to conservatives, let's return it to the American people. This is similar to the carbon fee and dividend plan advanced by the Citizens Climate Lobby. And this both prevents the size of government from growing and cancels out the sort of regressive effects of a carbon tax on its own. So because of this, the bottom 70% of Americans, these would be equally sized dividends. So according to the Treasury Department, the bottom 70%, 223 million, would be getting more back in dividends than they pay in increased energy prices. So they're sort of net financial winners. So this turns the politics of climate on its head, and you get to say to the American people, we're going to send you a check in the mail every month. Oh, and we're going to solve climate change, but don't worry about that. Most people don't think in long term, and the short term reward of the benefit of the dividend, cash dividend, sort of changes the political equation. Three, and this is a key selling point of the Baker-Schultz plan, it's sort of the grand bargain of it all. In exchange for a robust price on carbon, there's sort of a regulatory phase-out, rollback, and this is only on carbon regulation. So all of the regulations stay in place, but really at the point at which you have a robust carbon price, carbon regulations on the books sort of become redundant. And then finally, border carbon adjustments, and the TED Talk explains how this lays the groundwork for sort of a climate domino effect. I encourage you to check it out. So as mentioned before, well, I'll just actually return quickly here to the pillars of the plan. What you get to say, which is pretty impressive about this, is the first two pillars are sort of revenue neutral, and then the third pillar is shrinking the size of government, which is a key selling point for conservatives. And ultimately, the plan is far more effective than anything else to date in driving emissions reductions, about 3 times the emissions reductions as all Obama-era regulations combined. So if we're keeping our eye on the North Star, this is instituting or putting into place the optimal climate mechanism and being far more effective. Rex Tillerson, CEO of Exxon, former CEO of Exxon Mobil, former Secretary of State, has long been an advocate of this kind of mechanism. Milton Friedman, sort of widely considered to be the greatest conservative economist of the 20th century. I mean, there's no shortage of words of praise one can find about Milton Friedman. But essentially, he said very clearly, the question is, how do you reduce pollution? It's not by writing rules and regulations. The best thing to do is to impose a tax on the pollution and sort of make it in the self-interest of manufacturers and consumers to innovate new methods and technologies. Some notable conservatives who one wouldn't always know this from, I think, the political discourse, but if you look at policy conservatives, there's a whole host of support, including from Kevin Hassett, who is currently the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors to President Trump, Glenn Hubbard, Alan Greenspan, Art Laffer, Gary Becker. The Economist wrote a few years ago, sort of riffing on the old Winston Churchill line. Winston Churchill used to joke, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted all the alternatives. It's sort of a joke allies can make with each other, but the Economist riffed on this and said the world will one day adopt a carbon tax, but only after exhausting all the alternatives. Basically, at the point at which a government decides to act, it is the most efficient, cost-effective way to actually drive emissions reductions. So by making the market more accurate, the plan would unleash innovation to tackle the climate threat and would unlock far greater emissions reductions. These are some testimonials sort of from Baker and Schultz talking about the merits of this plan. Greg Mankiw, this is one of my favorite lines. He says, there are few panaceas in life, but the closest thing I know to a panacea, a cure-all in the climate change debate, is putting a price on carbon and rebating the revenue. Hank Paulson talking about the conservative merits of this plan. And I think one of the key things to sort of bring conservatives to the table is make sure that their principles can be represented in finding a solution. So all of these things are true about the plan, and we'll get to the endorsements in a second. And here's a chart just sort of outlining why this plan really is a win-win-win. It would deliver all sides of the political spectrum a genuine political win, and would exceed the high end of the U.S.'s commitment or former commitment under the climate accords. So if we're keeping our eye on the North Star, it's just way more effective, and I think it's why we're so excited that this framework provides the basis for a real bipartisan breakthrough. So the Climate Leadership Council, shortly after it launched, unveiled a list of founding members, including some surprising names: Exxon Mobil, BP, General Motors, Shell, not normally groups you see signing on to a tax on their essential product, some notable NGOs, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, notable individuals, Bloomberg, Stephen Hawking. He was alive when he signed on to this. Stephen Chu was Obama's energy secretary. Larry Summers served as Treasury Secretary to Clinton. And Exxon Mobil said the goal of carbon policy should be reducing emissions at lowest cost. We support proposal by the Climate Leadership Council. So people always sort of scratch their heads, and there's a lot of speculation about why exactly Exxon is involved. And I think the real answer is that if you look at these companies, right, they're thinking in the long term, and they know some sort of climate response is inevitable. And they would much prefer a single transparent price on carbon than a maze of regulations that differ by country. It's sort of not close. And they know that if they don't have a seat at the table, then they're on the menu. And this is an opportunity for them to make sure that there is a climate policy with reductions at lowest possible cost. So it's the full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal, sort of laying out why this has so many merits. Just this past month, or just a few days ago, in fact, on June 20th, Climate Leadership Council announced additional supporters, including Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen. Both were Fed chairs to Bush and Obama, and Christine Todd Whitman, who was EPA administrator under Bush. Some new companies and individuals signing on, and co-chaired by Trent Lott and John Breaux, Republican and Democrat. Trent Lott was actually the Republican Senate Majority Leader back in the 90s. So the question is turning to politics, and then this is going to explain where our student undertaking comes in. What's cooking with Congress, right? There is this plan with a lot of notable conservatives supporting it. Sort of on the policy expert side, there really is consensus about what the best way to approach this is. How about the halls of Congress? Policymakers and politicians are not always in sync. How do we bring them into sync? So I'm just going to share with you a quick clip. This is Senator Whitehouse talking, Democratic senator from Rhode Island, who's sort of one of the lead voices in the Senate on climate action. So let's just take a listen.
Alex, we're actually not getting the sound.
Aha. No sound. Interesting. It worked yesterday. Okay, I will just, for ease, summarize really quick. And we can send out the clip too afterwards. But in short, he says that actually there's a lot more support behind the scenes from Republicans in the Senate who tell him off the record they want to be part of a bipartisan piece of climate legislation, but they don't feel they can get there yet. They don't have support from their base, right? We call our political officials our elected leaders. They really are elected followers, right? Obama, for example, was against gay marriage. Then when the public opinion changed, so did he. So on the merits, there's a lot of support behind the scenes. He estimates somewhere between 10, maybe as much as 20 Republican senators who want to be part of a bipartisan piece of climate legislation, very much modeled after this one. And they're waiting for, quote, safe passage, as in support from their base, right? A Republican member of Congress can hear from environmental groups all the time, but they know odds are they aren't getting their votes no matter what. In most cases, they need to hear from their own base if they're going to take a step forward on this. So that's where Students for Carbon Dividends comes in. So I was an intern at the Climate Leadership Council last summer, returned to campus, was eager to bring sort of a student voice to bear. There was a lot of momentum growing on a national level in policy circles and this seemed like a golden opportunity to engage young people, particularly because my experience has been at Yale, and I know this is true on other campuses, that like the number of people interested in climate policy is far greater than the number who are actually involved in some sort of advocacy or climate, any sort of concrete climate initiative. And I think there's a real hunger for an outlet that A, is bipartisan, and B, will really move the needle. And for conservatives on campus, young conservatives, the data shows they're much more concerned about climate policy, much more likely to have studied climate science in school, and because they're young people, and we have many more decades of life ahead, and hence the most to gain from solving this problem. So this is our mission statement. Students for Carbon Dividends is a student-led movement that aims to catapult a free market climate solution, specifically the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividends Plan, into the national spotlight and open the door to bipartisan climate action. We launched in February of this year, about a year after the council launched. We're immediately covered, very lucky to get a lot of coverage in newspapers across the country. We didn't quite know what the response would be when we started, but we were quite heartened. Our founding coalition, we brought together 23 college Republican groups from campuses across the country, from Arizona and Kansas to Alabama and South Carolina. Some Democratic groups in the mix, Harvard College Democrats, Yale College Democrats, Princeton College Democrats, and others, and some environmental groups. And the idea was to showcase that this is, a Republican-led effort. This is a Republican-based plan. It's conservative principles, but this is the plan that provides a real basis for a bipartisan breakthrough. So this was our founding coalition. And this is the first time in history that a chorus of college Republicans has ever put forward a public statement on national climate policy, and notably sort of at odds, perhaps, with current leadership of the Republican Party. And I think what's sort of unique about this is it's kind of an intergenerational squeeze. They're the elder statesmen of the Republican Party calling for action, and now young people as well. So I encourage you after this to check out our website, s4cd.org, which has a lot more info. And just end with a quote here before we open for questions. This is from George Schultz and Larry Summers. They joint authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, but they said, "Our long experience in Washington has taught us that the transition from the inconceivable to the inevitable can sometimes be very rapid." So our goal is to make it so, and if you look at what we're doing as a student organization, is we're not just barking into the echo chamber. We're very much tailored on towards the on-the-ground realities. We know what the problem is. We know sort of what the optimal solution is, or at least an optimal solution that can garner bipartisan support, and we know there's support behind the scenes on the merits in Congress. And so the final piece of the puzzle is just making sure that there is clear support from the public, from constituents, most notably from conservatives, for this kind of action. So we really see ourselves as trying to fill that final step to get us to where we need to go for sweeping climate policy in this country. And that's why we're a pretty young group, but we're working to mobilize on campuses across the country, engage young people, and then hopefully open the door to a bipartisan breakthrough. So yes, we invite you all to join us, or to tell any young people to plug in and get engaged. And I'll now open to questions.
Great, thank you, Alex. As a reminder for folks, if you have any questions, we're going to take them in writing, so you can go to the bottom of your screen and click the Q&A box and type in any questions you have, and we have plenty of time to get to them. So I'll start with a question for you, Alex. What do student groups in Students for Carbon Dividends do? Is it mainly outreach to fellow students? Is it advocacy to lawmakers? Is it both?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we're still a pretty young group. In many ways, and we're still sort of crafting exactly what our agenda includes, our game plan includes. But first and foremost, it's groups signing on to endorse. I think there are many climate organizations that are rallying around the problem, and we see ourselves as rallying around the solution. And I think a lot of climate groups like to have a broad sort of spectrum of action, and there's a lot of merit to but I think by being sort of very directly pinpointed at a specific plan, we can have a concrete conversation in that regard. And for college Republican groups signing on, their mere endorsement is a news story, as was evidenced by our launch. So that's not true. I mean, student groups sign on to things all the time, and it hardly causes a ripple. In this case, Young Conservatives stepping forward is the future of the party, and as part of a bipartisan coalition, in and of itself sends a message. And we heard from folks on the Hill and from elsewhere that our launch people paid attention to it, and there was conversation in many congressional offices about what this means and why there's why there's a real need to take a leadership position for the Republican Party on this issue. But yes, what's on tap? We want to, of course, grow the base of support, get more groups into the coalition. We want to hold events, right? There's a huge, as mentioned, there's sort of this giant gulf between the public discourse and sort of the policy expert discourse. And I think even fairly liberal students or students in the environmental movement wouldn't be able to identify that there genuinely is consensus on the optimal climate mechanism. So our biggest lift, right, before you can mobilize, you have to have buy-in, and there has to be education. And definitely on the conservative side, there just hasn't been historically that much of a conversation about what it means to apply free market principles to tackle the climate threat. So we're trying to create that conversation and invest in campus education, and then B, with time, I think it's likely we will plug more in directly to congressional engagement.
Great. You mentioned the generational squeeze.
Yes.
Do you get the sense that young conservatives are generally in support of putting a price on carbon, or is it a subset of young conservatives who are joining your group and getting involved that are supportive of putting a price on carbon?
Yeah. So I'd say for now it's a subset. I mean, we have 23 college Republican groups, and we targeted ones that are particularly notable and reputable, and we think that sends a powerful statement. And I'd say the numbers on young conservatives of people who are interested in climate action generally far exceeds those who have come to appreciate and understand the merits of carbon pricing. And it's largely it's two things. It's an educational lift. Most people just don't know a thing about it, and that was when we were putting this coalition together. That was the biggest thing. Just Skyping into boards, talking with student groups, explaining the thinking, explaining the logic. It's not, most people just haven't considered it yet. And then two, going up against the T word, right? Carbon tax. A tax is not something that calling for a new tax is not something that's in the conservative ballpark by any means, and in most cases. And just explaining why this is really a corrective tax. It makes the market more accurate. It's internalizing the externality and is the pro-market thing to do. That's an educational lift as well. And many people just see the word tax and sort of recoil. And that's where we have to, that's a key place to overcome. A key challenge to overcome. We've had very good success rate when we have the chance to actually lay it out. But there's much more work to do on that front.
Great. We have a question about what kinds of students the coalition is open to. Is it strictly college students, or are you welcoming of other kinds of students, and is there an age limit to join?
So we are welcoming all kinds of students. We have focused on the college level for now, but we very much hope to expand in all directions. I think the biggest takeaway, I mean, when I was at the council last summer, we'd done an analysis on why cap and trade, the sort of Waxman-Markey bill from 2009-10 didn't succeed. And one of the key takeaways was that there was a lot of think tank support, some businesses, sort of the intelligentsia, so to speak, were on board. But what was really missing was the grassroots support, so that when members of Congress were considering this, they just weren't hearing from their constituents, and the lack of good public education about what exactly carbon pricing is there was a lot of turning towards fear, and yeah. So we, in order to battle the lessons of history, we want to make sure we're not doing that again. And we need a grassroots army. We think it makes most sense to grow from the college level out, but we absolutely want anyone and everyone to plug in. You can go to our website and type in your email address, and we'll keep you updated on what's cooking. And if folks are part of any student group that is interested in joining this coalition, there's an opportunity for student groups to sign on as well. Of course, the usual song and dance about social media. I'd say the other thing which is just important to highlight too is that the Baker-Schultz plan is a little bit more specific, and we are having groups sign on to the Baker-Schultz framework. So it's basically a price on carbon, returning the revenue, but not specifying where exactly that price should be. And then C, phase out of regulations that are, quote, no longer necessary. So we have a pretty interesting coalition in that it does stretch across the ideological spectrum. And folks have different interpretations of what no longer necessary means. And people have different interpretations of where the price should be set. But having groups sign on to a framework is a huge step forward in terms of orienting the public debate, right? If you have a conversation within a framework and get people to that framework and get conservatives in particular to sign on to the merits of carbon pricing, that's a huge victory. So in that sense, we're creating sort of a broad tent in that we're not specifying exactly what the policy flesh should be to this policy skeleton, but having a skeleton is a really important first step. And that's why we think this provides the basis for real engagement across the political spectrum.
That's a good point, that the endorsement is specifically for the Baker-Schultz plan. You mentioned earlier in the presentation the Citizens Climate Lobby and how they are also pushing for carbon dividend. Can you explain, is there a difference between the Baker-Schultz plan and the Citizens Climate Lobby carbon dividend plan?
Yes. The organizations back similar plans on the whole. If you get into like the specifics, the Baker-Schultz plan actually starts with a higher price of carbon as proposed in the initial document of $40 a ton. I think the Citizens Climate Lobby starts at $10 a ton, but the CCL's plan, their price of carbon grows a little faster than the Climate Leadership Council's plan. The key difference, though, is sort of pillar number 3, which is the grand bargain of it, which in exchange for a robust price on carbon, there's sort of a regulatory phase out. So that's the grand bargain of it that appeals to, I think, to conservatives and lays the groundwork for genuine bipartisan agreement on this. I know the CCL sort of is agnostic as to whether this plan should be in lieu of or on top of existing regulations, but basically, if you look at the politics of it, when we're actually looking at the final package and agreement here, it will very likely fall along the Baker-Schultz framework, that this will be part of the grand bargain.
Great, thanks. And then along those lines, we have a comment from Larry that the conservative elected officials really need to educate and constructively communicate to their constituents the importance of the issue. You mentioned the Sheldon Whitehouse clip. He says there's 10 to 20 Republican senators who would like to take some sort of action, but need the kind of safety of the support of their constituents. Do you know of a way? Have you gotten feedback from Washington about how conservative elected officials can actually, lead on this as opposed to follow? Are there any opportunities for that, or have you heard about what are kind of the best ways to get them the safety they need to be supportive of the plan?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, and I think that would be ideal, is having party leaders really educate and step forward. I think for most politicians, their number one goal is sort of getting reelected. That's where their incentives lie in most cases. So, I think this will be a story both of the base getting louder and calling for it, and then with that momentum, sort of elected officials maybe carrying the ball forward a little bit. But I think we can't just rely on members of Congress to lead. I think at this moment in time, they're just not seeing, if they look at what their base is clamoring for, any real need to lead on this issue. So until there's that, I think we're not going to see them stepping forward. I know a quote often attributed to Lincoln: "A good leader can't get too far ahead of his or her followers." So it'll be a little bit of both. And of course, there are plenty of senators still who, even if their base was calling for it, would not want to do it. So there's still a mountain to climb here. But I think firing up the base and explaining why this is a wise thing to support, and has all this business support too, which is quite significant, is a really important part of the path forward.
Yeah. Okay. Now, similarly, you mentioned that the grand bargain is kind of eliminating carbon regulations and replacing them with the price on carbon. What sense do you get that the political calculus mandates the revenue neutral component of it among conservatives particularly, rather than some other plans that would seek to reinvest revenue in carbon reduction strategies? What's your sense about that, particularly among conservatives?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. There's polling sometimes suggests that if you talk about reinvesting in clean technology, that it polls well. But I think anytime you're talking about a new tax, the revenue neutrality is going to be a really key selling point. There's a whole part of the Republican base whose chief sort of motivating goal is limiting the size of government. And in that sense, I think the revenue neutrality will be a really key part of this. It also simplifies the debate in that if you have a whole debate about what to do with the revenue, there are going to be so many interest groups sort of clamoring for a piece of the pie that ultimately you're going to divide. Lobbyists and organizations and create more division. There's elegance and power in simplicity, and on top of that, I think the dividend is a key component of this. Right, the carbon tax on its own is regressive, so we're trying to cancel that out, and the way for this to be a popular plan, a populist plan, is for people to be benefiting directly, and if in order for the plan to not only be implemented but to exist, to remain steady and in place for decades, and in order for there to be political will for the price to steadily rise, there has to be a positive feedback loop with the public. And the dividend really creates that. And I think not only in terms of the initial passage, but in terms of the sustenance of this kind of policy will be key.
Yeah, that's a helpful perspective. Thank you. Okay, we have one last question. If anyone else wants to submit a question, please type it into the Q&A box. Otherwise, we'll wrap up after this. We have a question from Henry. He says he's well past college, but he'd like to help students for carbon dividends. What can folks like him who are no longer students do to help? And then let me just piggyback on that and add, if there are students who would like to get involved, how can they get involved? So what can people past college do, and what can college students do?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say even if you're beyond a college age, you know anyone who's a student or is about to be a student, definitely encourage them to get involved. And I'd say in particular for conservative groups, it's not just the message, but the messenger. And I think allowing us to make the pitch to conservative groups as young people, and many folks on our team as young conservatives, that can be a real selling point. So if you have contact info or groups you think we ought to engage, the best thing to do would be to send that contact info to info@s4cd.org. The second thing is, we want this to be a bipartisan coalition. Republican-led, because I think that kind of leadership is important for creating real buy-in among the base. But this is a plan that genuinely has bipartisan appeal and delivers all sides of the political spectrum a genuine win. So we're growing beyond. Our initial coalition was just Republican groups, Democratic groups, and environmental groups. So we're growing, expanding the gamut to include, investment societies, international relations groups, military groups, campus religious groups. So if you know anyone who's in that kind of engaged in anything along those lines on their own campuses, wherever, definitely encourage them to plug in. I think we've been very, as mentioned, we've been very lucky to get the media spotlight, and I think having a real chorus of support around a specific framework will be really helpful. I think there's actually been a lack of specificity, and this helps answer that. Third and fourth thing, there are ways to plug in on the national level, separate from Students for Carbon Dividends, through Climate Leadership Council, through Americans for Carbon Dividends, who are independent organizations from us, but working in common cause. All three of our organizations have united around the Baker-Schultz plan. So checking out their website, Climate Leadership Council and Americans for Carbon Dividends, talking to your member of Congress, putting this on their radar, and I guess finally following us on social media, all of that. And we just filed for 501c3 status, and our ability to be effective is, of course, somewhat dependent on the funds we raise. So there will be a donation button on our website too very soon, and anyone who's interested in supporting us in that way as well will be much appreciated. But yeah, there are many ways to plug in, and I'm delighted that there's interest and enthusiasm.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this great presentation and for answering our questions, Alex. Really appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and close out the webinar now. And I want to thank all.
Can I just end with one last thing?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I often think about, this is sort of how I think about the climate challenge. I'm a history major, and I often think, we could have been born at any moment in history. We could have been born in ancient Greece and ancient Rome during the Gilded Age, the American Revolution. Could have been born at some point in the future. And in terms of our lifetimes, we occupy a pretty narrow sliver of history. So we, though, happen to be born at this unique moment where the full knowledge of the climate threat and the window to act on it is upon us. So sort of in historical terms, we are at the scene of the crime, we are at the scene of significance. And what we do or don't do will be debated and discussed, and more importantly, the consequences will be felt or not felt for generations to come. So history really has its eyes on us, to quote Lin-Manuel Miranda, and it's an honor to be working with all of you in this vital endeavor. So thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. So thank you again, Alex. Thank you to our attendees for joining today. We have recorded the webinar, and we will send a link to it once we're able to upload it to the website. And if you enjoyed today's presentation, please consider joining SACE so we can continue to work towards clean energy solutions for the Southeast. Visit cleanenergy.org for info on how to join and become involved. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.